Can you recall the very first time you looked at your mother? Do you have any recollection of being carried out of the maternity ward? Your initial meal, your very first plaything. Or that specific instant you wobbled onto your own 2 feet for the first time? Probably not, right? It feels strange because those were all monumental firsts in your personal history. Your parents can describe them vividly, where grandparents hold on to those images. Yet you, the protagonist of the story, have a memory that is entirely blank. Most people assume the explanation is straightforward. Your brain simply wasn't developed enough. You were just too small. However, that isn't the whole truth. The actual explanation is far more peculiar than you might imagine. A newborn's brain is actually capable of learning. It recognizes familiar voices and sounds. It was quietly documenting far more than you realize. So if your mind truly did record those early experiences, why is it impossible to retrieve them later in life? Welcome back to Nori. Today, we are going to trace the path of those vanished early memories and solve the mystery of why you cannot remember your time as an infant. In the field of psychology, this massive gap in our recollection is known as infantile amnesia. The vast majority of us, regardless of how intensely we strain our minds, are unable to recall any specific events that took place before we reached the age of 3 or 4. The scattered, blurry fragments that do remain are typically fractured, resembling old photographs that are smudged or missing their corners. During the last century, the famous psychoanalyst Sigmund Freud proposed a well-known theory regarding this. He suggested that we didn't actually lose those memories, but rather we were actively repressing them. He argued that infancy was a period filled with psychological tensions and emotional conflicts, so intense that the brain instinctively buried them to protect our developing psyche. However, when viewed through the lens of contemporary neuroscience and behavioral studies, this concept no longer stands up to scrutiny. The reality is that a newborn's memory apparatus isn't broken. It actually begins functioning from the very start. Consider a very compelling piece of evidence from the 1980s. A psychologist named Carolyn Rovi Collier performed a study to determine if infants, who are not yet capable of speech, could store data. She placed babies aged 2 months and 6 months into cribs. She then took a soft ribbon, tied one end to the infant's ankle, and attached the other end to a mobile of toys hanging overhead. Children are naturally inquisitive. When these babies moved their legs by chance, the ribbon pulled the mobile, causing the toys to rattle and sway. Within a very brief window of time, the infant's brains grasped the concept of cause and effect. They realized that kicking their legs resulted in the colorful objects moving. Consequently, they became incredibly enthusiastic, kicking repeatedly to generate their own entertainment. The most vital part of this study occurred several days later. When Rovi Collier returned the infants to the same cribs, she did not attach the ribbons to their legs this time. So, what happened? The moment they caught sight of the familiar toy setup, the babies began kicking their legs vigorously. They remembered, even a tiny 2-month-old is capable of recalling an event and holding on to that information for a few days. For those aged 6 months, they could retain that specific rule for several weeks. Your brain, even in its earliest stages, was fully equipped to learn, store data, and retrieve it. It was a small, high-functioning machine working remarkably hard. So, if the capacity for memory was present so early on, where did those records go as we matured? To find the solution, we have to look closely at the hardware inside your skull. Think of your brain as a sophisticated computer. When you experience an event, like walking through a rainstorm or spotting a dog, That data is funneled into a deep structure called the hippocampus. You can view the hippocampus as the computer's save button, or its short-term RAM. It is tasked with taking in new information and holding it temporarily. In newborns, this save button is actually quite functional from the moment of birth. This is why infants can remember that kicking leads to the toy moving. However, if you want data to remain on a computer for a decade or two, you can't just leave it sitting on the temporary desktop. You have to transfer it to the hard drive, assign it a specific name, and file it in a structured folder. You need to know what the file represents, where it occurred, and when it took place. In the human mind, the region responsible for this filing and labeling is the prefrontal cortex. This area is where the brain generates what researchers call episodic memory. This is the capacity to remember a narrative within its proper context. For instance, when I was 7, I fell off my bicycle at the school entrance, and a classmate helped me up. Herein lies the issue. The prefrontal cortex is the slowest growing part of the entire human body. It takes over 2 decades to reach full maturity. While you are an infant, this organizational filing system is barely operational. What is the result of this? It means that as a small child, you can retain skills, such as how to crawl or how to grip a bottle. You can recognize entities, like identifying your mother or a pet. But your brain is not yet capable of linking context, emotion, and a timeline to those mental images to form a cohesive event. Without the assistance of the prefrontal cortex, your earliest life experiences are like short, unlabeled video clips, drifting around in a disorganized heap inside your head. Naturally, data that isn't indexed is very easy to lose. However, an incomplete brain structure only explains why memories weren't filed correctly. It doesn't fully explain why they vanished entirely. There is actually a second process at work that is actively wiping your memory bank. Let's return to the analogy of the computer hard drive. Every hard drive, no matter how advanced, has a finite storage capacity. The physical space inside your head is limited, and the number of neurons is also capped at any given moment. During your first few years, you are essentially the most efficient learning organism on Earth. You must master 3D spatial awareness, muscle coordination, balance, walking, grasping objects, and thousands of other fundamental survival protocols. To manage this enormous cognitive load, your brain generates new neurons at a staggering rate. This biological process is known as neurogenesis. In 2014, researchers Sheena Jocelyn and Paul Frankland suggested a startling theory. They discovered that this massive surge of new cell growth was actually the primary factor erasing your memories. The logic is quite simple. When a high volume of new brain cells is constantly being produced and forced into the existing neural network, they require space to integrate. These new cells inevitably disrupt, overwrite, or even sever the old neural pathways, the very connections that house your memories. To put it bluntly, your brain is perpetually auditing its data and deciding what is most vital. Which is more important, the physical skill of maintaining balance so you can walk, or the fuzzy memory of yesterday, when you sat in the garden and tried to eat a flower? Naturally, the brain prioritizes survival. It determines that the flower memory is non-essential junk data. Consequently, it purges it, clearing space on the hard drive so new neurons can perform their duties. Scientists demonstrated this through studies on mice. They associated one specific corner of a cage with a tiny electric pulse. When a mouse entered that spot, it received a mild shock and would subsequently remember to avoid it. Then, the researchers manipulated the production of new brain cells. When they used medication to slow down the growth of new neurons, the mice developed very durable memories and avoided the danger zone for a long time. Conversely, when they accelerated the creation of new neurons to a high rate. The mice suddenly became extremely forgetful. The memory of the shock disappeared, and they wandered right back into the dangerous area. What can we conclude from this? Infants have their memories wiped more frequently than adults, because that is the period when the brain is most aggressively generating new cells. Forgetting your childhood isn't a flaw. It is a highly efficient evolutionary tool. Your brain must dismantle old data to make room for a more advanced survival architecture. We now grasp the biological reasons for memory loss. But from a behavioral psychology standpoint, there is another vital piece of the puzzle. This piece defines your very sense of self. Think about any clear memory you possess. Perhaps you remember your graduation. That memory includes friends, instructors, and the environment. But most importantly, it features a central character. That memory is viewed through your own eyes and narrated by the voice in your head. Science refers to this as autobiographical memory. To possess this, you must meet a condition that sounds simple, but is actually quite profound. You have to know who you are. You must possess a sense of self-awareness, an independent I that is distinct from the rest of reality. You have to understand that you are an individual entity, not just an extension of your parent or your surroundings. The issue is that newborns do not yet possess this I. In the initial months of life, a child's consciousness exists in a state of total fusion with their environment. To determine when this self-awareness emerges, psychologists use the mirror test. They secretly place a small red dot on a baby's nose, and then position the child in front of a mirror. For infants younger than 18 months, their reaction to the reflection is usually to reach out, tap the glass, or play with the other baby. They have no concept that the image is their own reflection. However, once they reach the 18 to 24-month window, a profound psychological transition occurs. The child looks at the mirror and pauses when they see the red spot. Instead of touching the glass, they reach up and touch their own physical nose. The moment that small finger makes contact with their face is the moment the I is officially born. This is the first realization of personal identity in a human's life. The child understands, this body belongs to me. I exist. It is no coincidence that the emergence of this self-awareness aligns almost perfectly with the point at which our earliest memories begin to stick. You can't remember things from before age 2, because at that time, there was no internal narrator to write the story down. In fact, some research indicates that if you tell a 4-year-old exactly what they did when they were 2, they will often insist, that wasn't me. That was someone else. The child isn't being dishonest. Psychology views the stage before the I as a completely different state of being. But there is still another factor to consider: language. Psychologists have realized that we don't use speech just for communication. We use it to structure and package our internal thoughts. Consider how a pre-verbal infant perceives the world. Their experience is composed entirely of raw, unrefined sensory data. For example, if a baby moves into a new home, they experience the sensation of cool air, the sight of a large blue door, and the image of a tree. But because they lack a vocabulary, those sensations have nothing to anchor to. They simply drift away. However, once you acquire language, everything changes. Speech acts like a catalyst for memory, or like digital tags used to index files. When a 3-year-old with a few thousand words stands in front of that same house, their brain applies labels: new house, blue door, big tree. By converting images into words, the brain can organize and retain information much more effectively. The power of language extends beyond mere labeling. Being able to talk allows you to do something an infant cannot: share your story. Every time you recount a past event, your brain retrieves that file, reinforces the neural pathways, and stores it back even more securely. Think of a grandparent who tells the same story about their youth over and over. Because they have repeated it hundreds of times, that narrative is etched so deeply into their brain that it becomes permanent. Infants lack this ability. They cannot say, "Mom, I saw a massive dog today." Because they cannot vocalize it or retell it, their experiences are never reinforced. They gradually fade into the background and disappear over time. This deep link between language, narrative, and memory leads us to a final, fascinating realization. The age of your very first memory is actually influenced by the culture you were raised in. Dr. Chi Wang from Cornell University researched various cultural groups and discovered a distinct variation. In Western societies, like the US or Europe, individual identity is highly prioritized. Parents in these cultures often talk to their children in ways that highlight personal feelings. They ask, "How did that make you feel?" Or, "What was your favorite part of the day?" They coach children from a young age to build personal narratives. Because of this constant practice with narrative language, people in Western cultures can typically remember things back to age 3.5. In the Maori community of New Zealand, where oral tradition and ancestral history are deeply respected, the results are even more striking. Children raised in an environment saturated with storytelling can often recall memories from as early as age 2.5. Conversely, in many East Asian cultures, where the focus is often on social harmony and the collective group, family dialogue may center less on the specific feelings of the individual child. Consequently, the brain doesn't receive as much language fuel for personal events. In these societies, the earliest memories often surface later, usually around age 4 or even older. This implies that the point at which the movie of your life begins to record is largely determined by how the people around you engaged with you. So, to summarize, why is it that we cannot remember being infants? You now have a comprehensive explanation. It isn't caused by just one factor, but rather a combination of several processes occurring simultaneously. You had a temporary memory system, but no method for filing data. Your internal hard drive was being constantly overwritten by a surge of new brain cells, so that survival skills could take precedence. You lacked the vocabulary needed to package your experiences. And most crucially, the version of you that exists as an independent self had not yet been established. All the minor, non-essential things we felt as newborns were the first items tossed into the mental recycling bin. It might feel a bit melancholy to realize we have lost the opening chapter of our life story forever. However, from an evolutionary standpoint, it was a necessary trade-off. That infant brain was operating at maximum capacity. It chose to forget the flower in the yard, the texture of a blanket, or the first sights of the world, so it could dedicate every resource to building a stable I. It dismantled itself, erasing old memory fragments one by one, to make room for consciousness, speech, and self-regulation. You cannot remember being a baby because that baby performed its task flawlessly. Its mission was to fade away so that the person you are today could take its place. The opening chapter of your life story was never truly lost or carelessly left behind in the dark. That tiny child lovingly dismantled its own awareness so the complex adult you are today could finally emerge. You can stop trying to force those missing fragments back into place, or feeling guilty about your blank slate. Forgetting the beginning was simply the necessary price paid to build a resilient and deeply functioning mind. What is the very first fleeting sensation you are absolutely certain belongs intimately and entirely to you? If this resonated with you, then softly place that earliest memory in the comments where others will quietly witness it. Your foundation remains permanently secure even when you cannot turn your head to look back at it.